Welcome to Nightville.
Prison? What prison? That's what most people around here would say if you asked them about the Ravens Bend Correctional Center. 2 decades ago, on the other hand, it seemed like nobody would shut up about it. From the PTA to the Chamber of Commerce, everyone was arguing about the jobs that it might bring and the supposed danger to our community. Not that I paid much attention back then. I was just a teenager. I had no way of knowing that in just a few years, I would be working at the place. Groundskeeper was my official job title, but in reality, all I did was cut grass and shovel snow. The pay was good for part-time work, and as a recent college dropout, it was the best that I was likely going to find. I never interacted with the prisoners, and only rarely with the staff. I would show up for work at 6, make my way to the equipment shed, and mow the enormous yard between the fences. The work was hot and monotonous, but with a good sun hat, a mask to filter the pollen, and some noise-canceling headphones, it was easy to just zone out. Almost 3 years went by like that, numb on autopilot, surviving rather than living. And then one foggy morning in November, I arrived at Ravens Bend and found that its gates were closed. Several correctional officers dressed in rubber ponchos were gesturing with flashlights, and I could hear the rumbling of buses in the facility parking lot beyond. Something was wrong. My boss, Brian Hartford, approached and held out a hand. He had never been an easy man to read, but that day his face was a stone mask. My services were no longer needed, he explained. Ravens Bend Correctional Center was closing down indefinitely. I would be mailed a final check along with 3 months' salary as compensation. At the time, I was too shocked to wonder whether my employers were buying my silence. The rumors flew for weeks afterwards. Some people claimed that there had been a disease outbreak. Others blamed asbestos in the walls or financial mismanagement. But the uncomfortable truth was that nobody knew for sure. The big shots at Ravens Bend were all from out of state, and the locals weren't talking. Some houses went up for sale, some agencies vowed to investigate. But it wasn't long before a drunk driving death at a local prom had pushed the story out of the news entirely. The facility was never demolished. I drove by it every day on the way to my new job, but after a few months, I quit looking out the window. Little by little, the Ravens Bend Correctional Center had faded from public memory. Even I, who had worked there for years, might never have thought about the place again if it hadn't been for a woman named Chelsea Ann Stowell. I got a bad feeling from the moment that I heard the doorbell ring. Stylishly dressed young women like the one outside were a rare thing in my neighborhood, especially after dark. I opened the door just a crack and asked what she had wanted. With a too bright grin, the young woman asked if she was speaking to a former employee of Ravens Bend Correctional Center. I told her that she was, but I didn't budge. I had no intention of removing the door chain, not until I figured out who the stranger was and what she was after. As though sensing my suspicion, the young woman introduced herself as Chelsea Stowell. Her husband Mark had died while incarcerated at Ravens Bend, and now she was searching for more information about the place. The longer I looked at her smile, the more the tragedy underneath seemed to shine through. She must have had the same conversation dozens of times, and from the desperate look in her eyes, she had been turned down more often than not. I hoped she could hear the sympathy in my voice when I told her that, unfortunately, I was only a groundskeeper at Ravens Bend. I hardly ever went inside the facility, and I rarely interacted with the prisoners. Chelsea shook her head. She didn't care about any of that. She said only one thing that mattered. Did I still have my keys? I was surprised to remember that I did. After I had driven back home that bizarre morning, I had shoved them into a desk drawer without a second chance. Chelsea saw my nod before I could hide it. Her eyes lit up and she asked if she could step inside. She had an offer for me, she said, but it was something that had to be discussed in private. I should have known then what I was getting myself into. I looked around my street, deserted except for a few teenagers drinking on the hood of a broken-down truck. A couple houses over, I could hear old man Danforth screaming at one of his dogs. I didn't have any proof, but I suspected that he raised them for fighting. The sweat from my shift at the local pizza place was still damp on my back, and this was all my life had amounted to, probably all that it would ever be. What did I really have to lose by listening to Chelsea's story? I unchained the door and I gestured to the couch. Chelsea cleaned off a corner of it with a wet wipe and sat down. The uncomfortable silence deepened. The makeup, the high-end clothes, the fake cheerfulness. It had all been a ploy to make it this far. But now that she finally had, she seemed unsure what to say. I thought that I was being helpful when I had asked what her husband had been in for. A fraud, embezzlement. Chelsea blushed, angry that I had made her say it. But that had nothing to do with the sort of man that Mark was. He was funny, considerate, and he loved his family. But after the trial, it was like the word criminal had been branded into his forehead. He died in that place, without ever having a chance to clear his name, to see who he could have become. I told her that I was sorry and that I meant it, but I didn't see how I could help. I want to stand where he stood, in the place where he... Chelsea trailed off. She wiped her nose with a handkerchief. There were already tears forming in the corners of her eyes. As gently as I could, I explained that what she was proposing was a serious crime. Besides, there was no telling what security measures had been set up around Raven's Bend during the past years, or how much the structure had deteriorated. "It's not breaking and entering if you've got the keys," Chelsea retorted. "And you know as well as I do that nobody's watching the place." I shook my head. What she was proposing was insane. $70,000, Chelsea whispered. "That's how much I'll pay you to get me into Raven's Bend." I began to say no for a second time, but then I hesitated. That was life-changing money. It was a down payment on a car, a house, a chance to finally get out of this shoddy little town that had let me down so often. I was about to ask Chelsea where she had gotten such a sum, but she beat me to it. "That's all that I have left of Mark's dirty money. As crazy as it sounds, I want to get rid of it, to start over clean. And to do that, I have to say goodbye." I asked Chelsea once again if she was sure about this. A smile crept across her face beneath the tears. She knew that she had won. After she left, I did a little digging of my own. I discovered that Mark Stowell had been a real estate developer who had made a fortune cutting corners and making impossible promises, and barely any of it was recovered after his arrest. I also learned that Mark hadn't been the only one to die at Ravens Bend Correctional Center. 3 inmates had been stabbed to death during a gang riot the year after the place had opened, and another was found hanging in the laundry room under mysterious circumstances. There was a guard as well, Officer Thaddeus Williams, who was felled by an aneurysm while on duty. Curiously enough, Officer Williams' death had come just 3 days before the complex was closed down. None of it seemed particularly out of the ordinary. In fact, out of all the deaths at Ravens Bend, Chelsea's husband's was the only one that stood out, specifically because of the lack of details. Only 2 brief articles had been written about his passing, and neither mentioned how he had died. One was accompanied by a black and white photo of the grieving widow, which proved at least that Chelsea was who she said she was. And when we met that Sunday to make our preparations, I caught myself watching Chelsea out of the corner of my eye. I began to understand what Mark must have seen in her. There was something endearing about her hard-edged features, about the way her eyes seemed to narrow when she was really focused on something. The gear that she had brought, however, left it clear that she was no trophy wife. Gloves, masks, rope, bolt cutters, and crowbars. The loadout that she had brought made it feel like we were breaking into the Louvre, rather than some vacant Midwestern prison that no one cared about. The amount of planning she had put into the whole thing gave me confidence, but the cold metal of the key ring in my hand took it away. I couldn't stop thinking about that bizarre morning, when I, and presumably every other employee of Ravens Bend, had been informed that we were out of a job. In spite of the security risk, we had all been sent home with our keys, badges, and work uniforms, and no one working inside had ever come forward about why the place had closed down. What had really happened behind those double-layered steel gates? The more I pondered those questions, the more troubled I felt. And by the time that Chelsea arrived to pick me up, my nerves were a mess. She, on the other hand, was cold as ice. The look in her eyes reminded me of an Olympic athlete who had spent years training for a single moment and was now coolly certain of success. The key ring jangled in my pocket like an omen as I climbed into her passenger seat, and we didn't talk. So late at night, the small town roads were nearly deserted. Only once did I spot a dark, gaunt shape, a deer maybe, slinking back into the undergrowth. There was nothing but fields and forest around the Ravens Bend complex, so we parked at the nearest possible place, a shuttered general store a few miles away. After driving around back to hide our vehicles from the road, Chelsea killed the engine, slung her pack over her shoulder, and trampled off through the long grass. She didn't look back to see if I was following. We skirted the edge of the woods, ready to take cover if any headlights approached, but none did. Chelsea set such a rapid pace that I had to practically jog to keep up with her, stumbling in gopher holes and over the branches of fallen trees. Even so, almost an hour passed before the massive black hulk of the Ravens Bend Correctional Center rose up before us. From Chelsea's grimace and the way that she kept checking her digital watch, I could tell that she was thinking the same thing that I was. We were way behind schedule. It was a strange feeling being back here after all these years. And during my absence, the grass had grown waist-high all the way up to the complex doors. But the place was otherwise free of the decay that I had expected. It reminded me uncomfortably of a sealed tomb. A metallic shriek made me jump. Chelsea was hacking through the fence with the bolt cutters that she had brought. She hadn't bothered to check whether it was electrified or equipped with an alarm, which gave rise to another uncomfortable thought. Had Chelsea known? Had she been here before? When she had first proposed this insane idea, I had been impressed by her preparation, by her blueprints and all of her itemized equipment, but now it was starting to scare me a little bit. And Chelsea held open the cut in the mesh wire and gestured for me to pass through. As we crossed the wide open fields between the fences, I couldn't help but glance up at the sniper towers on each corner. In my head, I knew they were empty, so why did I feel such a presence here? I considered mentioning it to Chelsea, but I changed my mind at the last minute. I didn't want her to think that I was losing my mind. Once we had reached the facility doors, I finally understood why Chelsea had needed my keys. Even with the heaviest equipment, breaking through the reinforced steel would have been nearly impossible, and closing the entrance again would have been impossible afterwards. I flipped through keys until I found the right pair, slipped them into place and stepped back. I took a deep breath. I didn't want to unbolt those locks, I realized. I didn't want to see what was on the other side. I wanted whatever was inside of Ravens Bend to stay in there, unseen for all time. And Chelsea looked at me expectantly. It was so quiet that I could hear insects whirring in the tall grass surrounding us. The pine trees sighed in the wind. Before I could stop her, Chelsea reached out and opened both locks with a fateful click. The thick metal door swung open, revealing a wide, unlit corridor that, after all these years, somehow felt unfamiliar. Just as with the exterior of the structure, all signs of deterioration were eerily absent. There was no dust, no rat droppings or cobwebs. It was like the place had just been holding its breath, waiting for us. As we crossed the threshold, I noticed a series of holes in the floors and walls. I remembered the tour that Mr. Hartford had given me the first day, how he had explained that in the event of a lockdown, wrist-thick bars would emerge to pin the doors in place. I warned Chelsea that if that happened now, I had no idea whether my keys would still be able to get us out. Instead of responding, she extracted a headlamp from her backpack and handed me another. With a reluctant look back at the clear night sky outside, I followed her into the darkness. With its white tiled floors and wide corridors, Raven's Bend looked more like a high school than a prison, at least until we got to the first cell block. The riot control gates had been left standing open, as had most of the cells. All of the furniture was still in place. I spotted some balls of crumpled paper on the floor, and a blue plastic lunch tray with a single long evaporated cup of coffee in one corner. The trash bags were still half full. Where had everyone gone in such a hurry? Chelsea paused several times to study the blueprints that she had brought, but for the most part, our route through the facility was straightforward. Neither of us spoke. We barely knew each other, and even the squeak of our footsteps on the yellowed, tiled floor felt too loud. I suppose that Chelsea's thoughts were with her husband, reliving the times that she had visited him here, imagining what life must have been like behind bars. I mean, that's why we were here, wasn't it? To give her some kind of closure. She would spend a while in a cell, say her goodbyes, and then pass along to me the last of his dirty money. I mean, sure, it seemed like an extreme way of handling grief, but who was I to judge? And we continued on in silence until the lights overhead came on. Chelsea looked over her shoulder at me. Terror sparkled in her eyes, although whether it was a fear of being caught or of something far worse, I couldn't have said. The way she looked at me for help made me irrationally angry. She was the one who had gotten us into this mess. She was the one who should have known that this was going to happen. I cringed, expecting police, barking dogs, or blaring alarms, but none came. It was as though somebody else had just flicked on a switch. I had an insane urge to whisper a hello into the empty cell block, even if only to prove that all of this was really happening. I really was here, in the closed-down prison where I used to work, helping a woman who I had met come to terms with her husband's death. And now I had a reason to believe that we weren't alone. We crouched down behind a grim metal table in the center of the common area. I had figured that from there it would be more difficult to spot us from the hallway. But what about the cells up above? The place was designed to be a panopticon, to be observable from all sides. Even though I knew no one could be up there, my gaze kept drifting up, as though I might spot some awful face grinning down at us from over a railing. Minutes passed. There was still no movement. I wanted to make a run for it. Chelsea pointed urgently toward the next corridor. "We can't turn back now," she pleaded. "We're almost there, and if we turn back early, there will be no payment." And greed was the only reason that I was able to convince myself that maybe, just maybe, what we were seeing was a fluke in the electrical system. Quickly and silently, we advanced toward the next cell block, the one where Mark had supposedly been incarcerated. We had passed by several rooms whose purposes I couldn't discern along the way, but the enormous dryers and clothing hampers beyond the upcoming doors made it clear. We were passing by the prison laundry. There were half-folded stacks of towels, enormous bottles of detergent, and a pair of dangling, kicking feet. I looked away, telling myself that I couldn't have seen what I thought I had. There wasn't a black silhouette hanging by its neck from the crossbeam. It hadn't opened a pair of pale, bloodshot eyes and glared at me. I hadn't heard the gurgling of its swollen purple tongue squirming around in its mouth as it glared at me. All of that was impossible. I must have just had what was it called? A stress-induced hallucination. And Chelsea's attitude proved it. She was continuing straight ahead as though nothing was wrong. I, on the other hand, couldn't help but stare over my shoulder at the wide-open laundry room door. Part of me longed to look again, and part of me didn't dare. The cell block ahead was identical to the one that we had just left behind, a common area ringed by 3 floors of cells. "Mark's is on the 2nd floor, 3rd from the right," Chelsea was telling me. "Now if you'll just..." A sudden bang cut off Chelsea's instructions. Her face went pale. "Oh my God, hide!" And Chelsea scrambled into the nearest open cell and squeezed beneath one of the bunk beds. Reluctantly, I did the same. I held my breath and tried not to think about what would happen if the door to our hiding spot suddenly slammed closed. I recognized the sound coming toward us from a dozen prison movies. It was a nightstick bashing against metal. Was someone trying to scare us, or was the noise entirely unrelated? In an angry whisper, I told Chelsea that she needed to tell me everything she knew, now. If she didn't, I threatened that I would step outside and give myself up to whoever was coming. "If you do that," she answered coldly, "we're both dead." Chelsea had called my bluff, and now that the loud, brutal clanging was closer, I was no longer at all sure that I could make myself go through with it. Peeking out from beneath the bed, I caught sight of a broad-chested young man in uniform who wore his hair shaven to the skin beneath his guard cap. He lurched into a cell across from ours, and he began attacking everything in sight, from the bunk beds to the stainless steel toilet. Anyone else would have run out of steam after just a few minutes, but the guard just kept on going long after his tendons should have been torn and his muscles turned to jelly. Still unsatisfied, he reared back and bashed his face into the unbreakable glass. I bit down a stream of blood splattered out from the point of impact, again and again until the guard's face was a little more than a mangled, red raw skull. His teeth were broken, one eye dangled loosely from its socket, but in the brief moment before his features were destroyed, I had recognized him. Officer Thaddeus Williams, the guard who had collapsed from an aneurysm while on duty. He was somehow horribly here. And he was angry. Angrier than I had thought it was possible to be. The deadly, self-inflicted damage hadn't slowed him down a bit. He continued his rampage in the common area, and at any moment he might look toward the cell where Chelsea and I were hiding. A part of me longed to make a run for it, and part of me knew that that was the most dangerous thing that I could do. I could already imagine those legs stretching hideously as Officer Williams chased after me. Having run out of things to smash in the common area, the thing that had been Thaddeus Williams slunk back towards the corridor that he had come from, hammering his baton against anything within reach. It was only after the clatter of his rage had died out completely that I dared to speak. And my first words to Chelsea were, "What the hell was that?" "And they come back," she murmured, as though trying to convince herself as much as me. "And the ones who die here, they come back. That's why this place closed down in the first place. There was this officer, a guy named Williams. Mark and all the others were terrified of him. Mark said that he did the job for the pleasure of it, just to hurt people. The higher-ups didn't like to talk about it, but Williams actually died while attacking another inmate, in that cell right across from us. Imagine dying like that, with all that hate in your veins. Imagine what it might turn you into." The whole thing would have sounded insane if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. Now our break-in finally made sense. Chelsea hadn't just come here to pay respect to her husband's memory. She was actually hoping to meet him. We both looked nervously toward the same cell on the second floor, the third one from the right. It stood open like it was inviting us in. My voice cracked like a scared child's as I told Chelsea that I understood if she wanted some time alone with him. She shook her head. We've come this far together." Chelsea smiled and squeezed my shoulder, and then she looked nervously toward the long corridor where Officer Williams had gone. "And besides, I don't think it's a good idea to get us separated. We don't know what else might be in here with us." And the echo of our footsteps on the metal stairs sounded as loud as a ringing bell. If Officer Williams or anything else was nearby, it had surely heard our progress. At last, we came to a halt in front of Mark Stowell's cell. It was empty, apart from a single brown-haired figure in a prison jumpsuit. I almost wished that he had been floating in the air, that his fingers ended in monstrous black claws, or that his flesh had been rotted down to the bone. Somehow anything would have been better than just that slim, solitary figure, staring emptily at a bare concrete wall. And when we reached the doorway, it turned toward us. Mark Stowell was in his late 40s and handsome in a craggy sort of way. I could see why so many people had trusted him. The sparkle in his hazel eyes and his sly grin were almost enough to make me forget that the man standing in front of me was undeniably dead. A look passed between Mark and Chelsea, one not just of love, but complicity. Some sort of signal had been given. And then everything seemed to happen at once. Chelsea shoved me into the cell and tried to slam the door shut behind me. But I blocked it with my foot. Mark, or the thing that had once been Mark, lunged at me, its mouth open wide. Its morgue, cold hands closed around my throat, its jaw distended like a constrictor snake's. As I kicked and screamed, I could feel my life force, my energy, my will to live, everything that made me, me, being pulled into the black pit of its mouth. I toppled over onto my back. The cell door bashed into my ribs again and again as Chelsea fought to slam it shut. Mark's awful, dangling jaw inched closer to my face. And then we heard it. The steady hammering of Officer Williams' nightstick, getting closer with each passing second. It was all the distraction that I needed. Mark let out an inhuman howl of rage and hunger as I wiggled out of his grip. Chelsea shrieked and tried to trap me with the door for a second time, but she was too late. I was already free. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see Mark bounding after me on all fours like some sort of horrible dog. "Hurry, baby," Chelsea hissed. "He's coming." I threw myself down the stairs, crashing into one railing after another. I sprinted madly down the first corridor that I came to, only to realize that I was going deeper into the facility. It was too late to turn back now, however. Chelsea and Mark were closing in, and Officer Williams' Revenant wasn't far behind. I skidded through another cell block. My breath came in ragged gasps and I was seeing spots. How long had it been since I had run so fast or so desperately? At last now I understood why Chelsea had wanted me to come with her. It wasn't just my keys and badge that she had wanted, it was me. She needed me to be some sort of sacrifice that would give life to her husband. For all I knew, she had been inside of Raven's Bend before. And for all I knew, this was what she had planned from the beginning. If I ever got out of this, maybe I would find that several other former Raven's Bend employees like myself had disappeared lately. Somewhere behind me, I heard a violent crash, a struggle, and a sudden sharp scream. Officer Williams had caught up with Mark, and from the sound of the fight and Chelsea's scream, the results were brutal. I would never get a better chance to find a hiding spot. But where could I go? If the dead had truly walked these empty halls until dawn, what chance did I have of staying undetected? There was a wide open, tiled area to my left, the shower room. From the corridor, I could see a changing area, 2 long walls of shower heads and a dozen toilet stalls. Apart from the slow, steady drip of water, there was no sign of movement in that labyrinthine space. It was perfect. I would be able to get out of the way of whatever was approaching without cutting off my own escape. If the pursuer got near, I thought, at least there was more than one way out. I pressed my back against a wall and fought to calm my heaving breaths. I was surprised to find that the tile was damp. If I squinted, I could see a thin stream of dark water flowing beneath the drainage grates. Had the room been in use lately, and if so, why? I looked nervously from the benches of the changing area to the unusually small stall doors, and then I eyed the faucets and shower heads. Where was that dripping noise coming from? The chaos from the corridor called my attention away from the mystery. Someone hurried past, gasping and limping, Chelsea, I suppose. The racket of slams and snarls behind her had faded out, replaced by a familiar, repetitive sound. Clanging. Mark must have thrown himself at Officer Williams to give Chelsea a chance to escape. In spite of what they had tried to do to me, I had to admit that they must have really loved each other, but it hadn't made any difference. Officer Williams' uncannily quick marching steps were closing in on Chelsea, and the next blow from the nightstick impacted with something very different from a metal bar. There is a crack and a squelch, like a melon breaking open, and then an awful tearing noise that I couldn't bring myself to describe. Chelsea never had a chance to scream. When it was over, Officer Williams resumed his marching steps, pausing only to unleash his rage on the gates and furniture. I was faced with a terrible choice. Raven's Bend was a rectangular structure, and unless I was mistaken, the shortest way to the exit was now straight ahead. The same path that Officer Williams had taken. My only other option was to risk backtracking past Chelsea's mangled remains, Mark's cell, and the thing hanging in the laundry room. For all I knew, I still might come face to face with Williams anyway, as he continued his eternal patrol. I took a deep breath and decided to press on. I peered around the corner of the tile wall to make sure that the coast was clear. And there they were, 3 figures in prison jumpsuits. One held a shiv, another a length of pipe. The third was armed with the jagged edge of a broken lunch tray. One of the headlines that I had read flashed through my mind. 3 killed in riot at Raven's Bend. While I had dithered and debated which way to go, they had been tiptoeing closer. And didn't even hear us coming. The one with the shiv chuckled, twirling the little blade between his fingers. Yeah, looks about ready to piss himself. The one with the bent pipe added. His jumpsuit was riddled with bleeding holes. The man holding the sliver of lunch tray made a hideous gurgling sound, and I realized that his throat had been roughly severed, probably with the same improvised weapon that he was holding. The falling droplets fell onto the shower room floor. That was the noise that I had been hearing. I took an unconscious step away from the bloody trio. "And be still," the shiv man warned me. "We can make this hurt a little, or we can make it hurt a lot." His jaw dropped low just as Mark's had. I could feel my energy drawn toward the black pit of his mouth as though pulled by an invisible tide. I ran. "Hold him," the shiv man snarled. I vaulted over a changing room bench and took off, ignoring the curses and inhuman gurgling behind me. My lungs burned from the effort. 1 cell block and 1 left turn, I told myself that was all. If I could make it that far, I could slam the door on this nightmare forever. Slam the door. Wasn't that what Officer Williams had been bashing his nightstick against? The bars of the gated doors that separated the cell blocks. There was another one just up ahead. They had to have been left open during the evacuation or whatever it had been, but my old manager had warned me about those gates and how they locked automatically if closed. I slammed the gate shut as I went through it, and I was rewarded by the reverberation of my 3 pursuers crashing into its bars. The man with the bent pipe snapped his teeth at me like a rabid animal. His accomplice with the split throat started biting the bars. Shiv Man, however, simply reached through them. His joints dislocated sickeningly. Blood oozed like tears from the fractures in his skull as he pressed his head into the gap between the bars. His body was breaking, but he was pulling himself through. I had slowed them, but not for long. I barreled blindly onward, across the final cell block, and put 2 more gates between myself and the frenetic footsteps behind me. To my left was the way out into the exercise yard. To my right, the officer where I had signed my work contract at Raven's Bend all those years ago, which meant that the exit was dead ahead. Officer Williams walked out into the corridor in front of me. He didn't say a word. Didn't seem to even notice the fluids oozing from his face onto the front of his uniform. He just slapped his nightstick casually against his thigh like a hungry kid waiting for the lunch bell. And then he charged. His long scissoring steps would have shattered the legs of an ordinary adult, and I knew from the moment that I saw him closing in that I didn't have the strength left to dodge. His nightstick collided with my kneecap. I heard the 6th snap before I felt the pain. The agony was blinding. I dropped to the floor, cradling my leg, and I saw Williams' polished boots continue past. It was clear where he was going, toward the 3 figures in jumpsuits that had just pulled their broken bodies through the final gate. I groaned, rolled onto my stomach, and crawled toward freedom. And behind me, the sounds of violence echoed through the empty prison like a cannibal concerto. While the restless spirits of Raven's Bend fought one another, I fumbled with the keys. I bit my own wrist to calm my shaking hands as I jammed them into the double lock and twisted. Cool night air rushed across my sweat-soaked skin. I tore the keys free, lunged outside, and locked the doors behind me. Out here, with the moss, the meadows, and the moonlight, it was almost possible to believe that everything that happened inside Raven's Bend was a bad dream. But the pain in my knee said otherwise. I half-hobbled, half-crawled back to the tree line, where I fashioned a crutch out of a downed tree branch. The sun was rising by the time that I made it back to the road. I told the trucker who had stopped for me that I had wandered off the trail while hiking and I had gotten hurt. Uh-huh, he said, looking over his shoulder at the Ravensbend access road a mile back. And we didn't talk anymore after that. The doctors confirmed what I'd already feared. My kneecap was broken. It would mean months off my feet, followed by an even longer period of recuperation. It would mean sinking even further into debt, as well as having far too much time to think. I thought about the people who had been incarcerated at Ravensbend in the early days when the strangeness first began to manifest. I thought about what it must have been like to see and experience those horrors, only to be disbelieved by the prison staff. I thought about what it must have been like to wake up in one of those metal cots, to find dead men with makeshift weapons squeezing through the bars, or to be a night shift guard pursued down sleeping hallways by the clanging of William's nightstick. What must it would have been like during those final days before the authorities finally admitted that the impossible was real. I never reported Chelsea missing. For all I knew, she's still in town in a way, and I haven't driven past Ravensbend since. If anybody asks me about my time there, I'll join the chorus of my friends and neighbors. Prison? What prison? I forgot it was ever there. And maybe some places are better left forgotten.